James suddenly disappears without a word. Is this a golden opportunity, or a cruel trap to tear him away from Diep and little me on the hill? Wishing all of you a warm, peaceful and love-filled Christmas as we uncover the truth together. Morning fog still clung to the mountain when James and Diep stepped into the ginger field. The soil was damp under their shoes. Rows of green leaves ran along the hillside. A few farmers in faded shirts waited, hopeful eyes on James, the man who'd kept his word with corn, then pomelos, and now ginger. James crouched, pulled a ginger clump from the earth, and brushed the wet soil from his fingers. "This is good," he said, smiling at the farmer. "If DJ takes this harvest, we'll lock in a stable price. No cutting you down at the last minute like the traders do." Diep stood beside him with a small notebook, listening to every number and promise. "If the market price drops later, can we still keep this rate?" she asked quietly. "Maybe we earn less," James replied. "But trust is worth more. If they trust DJ, DJ survives." An older farmer chuckled. "With you two here, we sleep easier. Before, when traders came, it felt like facing a storm." Right when the atmosphere was warmest, James's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. 2 letters. Dad. He froze for a heartbeat, then looked at Diep. "I'll just step over there to take this," he murmured. James walked to the edge of the field where the wind was harsher and pressed the phone to his ear. "Dad, it's me." His father's voice came through, clipped and firm. "Pack your things. You're going on a long business trip. There's an important partner in another province. If you handle this well, your position in this family will finally change." James's fingers tightened around the phone. "How long?" "A few months," his father said. "When it's done, we'll talk. Until then, don't mention marriage with that girl on the mountain again. Prove yourself first." The ginger field blurred at the edges. James saw instead a small house on the hill, Diep and little Nye waiting there. "Dad, DJ still has a lot of work." "Your job is to prioritise this family," his father cut him off. "That small company on the hillside, if needed, I'll arrange something." "Right now you do as I say." The call ended with a flat beep. On paper, the business trip was an opportunity. In his father's eyes, it was also a rope to pull James away from the hill. He took a breath, put the phone back in his pocket, and walked toward the farmers again. Diep studied his face the moment he came close. "Was that your father?" she asked softly. James forced a small smile. "Yeah. He wants me to go on a long business trip. Important project. He said if I do well, it'll be easier to talk about us later." Diep's grip on the notebook tightened. "Long? How long is long?" "A few months," he admitted. "He says it's important for my career, and if he sees I can handle bigger things, maybe he won't fight our wedding so hard." Diep looked over the ginger rows shining with dew. Farmers were bent over their crops, trusting DJ, trusting James. Her own future suddenly sat inside 2 words. Business trip. She swallowed and kept her voice steady. "If this trip helps your father accept me more easily," she said, "then you should go. Nye and I will wait." James stared at her, his chest tightening. As always, she was the one stepping back so he could move forward. "I'll come back as soon as I can," he said, "and while I'm gone, DJ will be in your hands." On the ride back, the old motorbike rumbled along the familiar red dirt road. Diep sat behind, arms wrapped around his waist, cheek resting against his back. She didn't say much, just listened to his heartbeat beneath his thin shirt. "Your business trip," she finally said, her voice almost carried away by the wind. "Let's treat it like one more buying trip to a far village. The road home is still this hill, this house. Nye and I will still be here." James didn't answer. He adjusted his grip on the handlebars and squeezed her hand where it rested on his stomach. In his heart, he repeated, "Whatever my father plans, this house, this woman, this child, that's home." That afternoon, at the DJ office by the 3-way junction, James spread the ledger out on the old desk. Motorbikes came and went outside. Voices and engine noise filled the air. "This is the ginger book," he said, pointing. "Here is quantity, here is price, here is what we owe. When you pay them, make them count again in front of you. We don't cheat them, but we also don't let anyone cheat us. Diep leaned closer, memorising the way he explained things. And if someone tries to force us to lower the price, she asked. James gave a small, confident grin. Then you say, DJ already gave our word to the farmers. We don't break our price. If people don't play fair, we don't play with them. An older farmer stepped through the doorway, surprised to see Diep in the main seat. James raised his voice just a little on purpose. From now on, if I'm not here, you can come straight to Diep. She's DJ's right hand. Her word is my word. Diep lifted her head in embarrassment, but the farmer simply laughed. That's good. She writes carefully and speaks kindly. We trust her. By the time the sun sank low over the junction, James had locked the office door and tucked the ledger under his arm. The motorbike could only climb part of the hill, so at the steepest stretch they walked side by side, pushing it together. The path was quiet except for their footsteps. When do you have to leave? Diep asked at last. My father wants me to go as soon as possible, James said. Maybe in a few days. Diep nodded, swallowing her disappointment. Then tonight, when Nee sleeps, go through everything with me one more time, so when you're gone, I don't make mistakes. That night, the little house on the hill was lit by a single yellow bulb. Nye slept curled on the small bed, clutching her stuffed bear. At the wooden table, James and Diep sat close, papers and notebooks spread between them. James finished explaining the last column and set the pen down. I know it's a lot, he said gently, but if you forget anything, write your own notes. You don't have to do everything exactly like me. Diep flipped back through the pages. Her fingers paused over the letters DJ that James had scribbled in the early days when everything was just a dream. After a long silence, she spoke without looking up, her voice calm but heavy. If I didn't have this kind of past, do you think your father would still send you away right after we talked about getting married? The question hung in the warm, dim air between them, thin as a blade and just as sharp. James stared at her, feeling the question land where he was weakest. For a second, he wanted to say no without thinking, but the truth pushed against his chest. He dropped his gaze. I don't know, he said quietly. Maybe he wouldn't. Maybe he still would. My father always finds a reason to control things. Diep gave a small nod, as if she had already expected that answer. She closed the ledger. It's okay, she said. You don't have to defend him. I just needed to know it's not all my fault. Something in her voice made James flinch. He realised how much she'd been carrying alone. The label of divorced woman, the whispers, the way people counted on their fingers when they looked at Nee. He reached across the table and covered her hand. Listen, he said, steadying his voice. No matter what he thinks, I chose you. I chose Nee. This trip is not me running away. It's me trying to come back stronger so I can stand in front of him without shaking. Diep's eyes softened, but the tiredness stayed. I believe you, she said. I'm just scared that while you're gone, he'll move faster. Men like your father don't waste time. James wanted to promise nothing would happen, but he couldn't. Instead, he squeezed her hand. Then until I get back, you protect DJ and Nye, he said. I'll deal with my father. That night, he barely slept. He lay awake, listening to the breathing of the two people he loved most. Sometimes Nee rolled closer to Diep in her sleep, as if afraid someone would disappear. The next morning, the sound of footsteps came up the slope. Diep looked out and blinked. Mum? James's mother stood at the doorway, slightly out of breath, a bag of food in her hand. If I waited for your father to agree, I'd never see you, she said with a tired smile. Inside, the house smelled of rice and ginger tea. She sat down, looking around the small room she already knew too well. I heard he's sending James on a business trip, she said. Yes, Diep replied. He said if the trip goes well, it'll be easier to talk about our wedding. His mother let out a long sigh. When a man says business trip, sometimes it's just work, she said. When his father says it can also be a move on the chessboard. Diep felt her stomach tighten. What are you trying to tell me? The older woman glanced toward Nee's little bed. I'm telling you to keep every document safe, she said quietly. Anything with your name, James's name, this house, DJ or Nye. Your father-in-law prefers to make changes when the people involved are not there. Do you think he'll try to take something from us? Diep whispered. I think he'll try to take control of everything, she answered carefully. I can't stop him from planning, but I can warn you to be ready. I'm on your side, even if I have to stand quietly. She squeezed Diep's hand before she left. Her hug at the door lasted a little longer than last time. Later that day, James packed his old backpack, a few shirts, some papers the drawing knee had given him. She watched from the doorway, holding her bear tight. Are you really going, Dad? She asked. I'm going to work far away for a while, he said softly, to earn money so we can fix the roof and buy you a new dress. How many sleeps until you come back? More than you can count, he answered, but less than the number of times I'll miss you. On the morning he left, fog wrapped the hill in white. The slope outside the house was slick with dew. James checked his backpack, then turned to Diep. So this is it, she said, forcing a smile. Just another buying trip. Just another buying trip, he echoed. Only a bit longer. He stepped closer and cupped her face. Take care of yourself, he said, and take care of DJ like it belongs to both of us, because it does. Then you remember this, she replied. No matter where your father sends you, this hill is where you started over. Don't forget that. He kissed her forehead, hugged her knee one last time, then walked down the slope to the waiting bike. Halfway down, he stopped and looked back. Two small figures stood at the top, framed by the crooked doorway. He raised his hand. Diep lifted hers. Then he turned the key and rode away. In town, his father sat behind a wide desk. In front of him lay a stack of contracts, land papers and company forms. A secretary stepped in. Mr. James has boarded the bus, sir. His father nodded, eyes on the documents. Good. We'll begin rearranging DJ while he's gone. And about the house on the hill. Move it under your authority? The secretary asked. For now, he said calmly. A man in this family does not build his future on a random slope with a woman the village threw away. Once he understands that, we'll discuss everything again. That afternoon, Diep sat alone in the DJ office at the three-way junction. The ledger felt heavier than usual under her hands. She checked each line twice, the way James had taught her. A motorbike stopped outside. A delivery man walked in holding a large envelope. Are you Miss Diep from DJ? He asked. Yes. Please sign here, important documents. She signed, thanked him, and waited until he left. Then she opened the envelope. Inside were pages stamped and signed. Her eyes went quickly over the lines. There were clauses about temporary management if James was away for a long time, notes about authority to oversee DJ, and notices tied to the land where their house stood. At the bottom, two names repeated, her father-in-law's and James's. The DJ office suddenly felt too small. She placed the papers on the table, palms flat, breathing slowly until the rush in her ears faded. So this was what his mother had tried to warn her about. The trip wasn't just a test between father and son. It was the first move in a plan to push her and Nee to the edge. She stepped to the doorway and looked toward the distant slope. The hill was just a dark shape against the evening sky now. If he's not here, she whispered, can I really protect this house, this company, this child? Her fingers tightened around the doorframe. A moment later, she answered herself in a low, steady voice. I have to, because if I don't, there will be nothing left for him to come home to.
Đồng mía cao dần, 45 đồng trở thành hy vọng cho phiên chợ. Một cây mía đổ bất ngờ khiến cả nhóm kêu, rồi cười xòa vì kịp đỡ nhau. Chiều xuống, Linda buồn bã vì con rúi của mình đã biến mất. Nghi có kẻ trộm rình quanh nhà. CEO quang ghế đến lắng nghe và trấn an sửa và tự sửa chiếc camera cũ trong kho, kéo dây lắp trước sân nhà để bảo vệ cô. Đêm đến, Linda nấu cơm nếp cẩm mời anh ở lại ăn. Hai người trò chuyện lòng ấm lại. Quang kể áp lực công ty, camera nháy sáng, bóng lạ thoáng qua, và không biết Linda có sống sót qua được đêm nay không. Mọi người nếu thấy video hay, hãy cho mình một like, một subscribe. Cảm ơn mọi người nhé.